Welcome. Good afternoon. So lovely you're joining. While people are still dropping in, we're getting ready to start. How exciting you are joining for today's online lunch event, where we will discuss how to bring ecocriticism into the art academy. On behalf of Mister Motley and ArtEZ, studium generale, I would like to welcome you. So in this space, we will talk about the state of the arts in relation to today's challenges. And in this school year, we have collaborated on the theme of land and environmental questions in creative practices. My name is Chihiro Geuzebroek, and after speaking as a climate creative on the previous online lunch event, I am happy to be back today as your host. So on to the program. We will explore 3 strands of curiosity today. One, we'll be looking into the conditions that are conducive to activating students in a certain eco-activism within the academy. 2, we will zoom in on the actual practice as a teacher or guest lecturer of making eco-critical curriculum. And then we'll break for a Q&A. So this is also the point where I say at any time during the session, please start already commenting in the chat. We will take a look at that and we'll weave it into our conversation best we can. So yeah, more instructions on comments and questions are currently dropped in the chat by Jana. And the final strand is just rethinking the institution through an eco-critical lens. This can be the architecture, the values, the decision-making. It is all on the table. So I'm very, very happy to be introducing our guests. And so let's get started. She is a climate justice creative, a campaigner, researcher, lecturer in environmental justice, as well as a trainer in creative strategies for decolonization. She has worked internationally, positioned in the UK and in the Netherlands in recent years, working in solidarity with Indigenous organizations, most notably in Canada and Nigeria. From co-founding the UK Tarzans network to being part of the Art Not Oil Coalition, she has centered anti-oppression in environmental work through different waves of movement in the past 12 years. She's currently a practice tutor in Ecological Futures at the St. Joost School of Art Design, and she is a powerful force of nature. I am so happy to welcome you with us here today, Suzanne Dhaliwal. So yeah, this is the silent applause in sign language. Feel free to join me in welcoming Suzanne here. Next up, we are joined by the Artistic Collective, also described as a collaborative organism in and of itself that started bubbling in 2014 between 2 friends, both trained as landscape architects and visual artists. A few years later, new people joined who are also trained as in other backgrounds, such as studying fashion at ArtEZ and Arnhem. However, the Jan van Eyck Academy here was, I think, an important petri dish for this collaborative to start bubbling and kickstarting beautiful collaborations. The Onkruidenier creates on the intersection of the relationship between plants and landscape and humans, with a particular focus on the unwanted nature in the city, the weeds. So through on-site fieldwork and research and artistic practice, they help transform familiar everyday actions into experiential narratives. And they'll be talking to us about that today. Today we have with us not just 1, but 2 of these delightful artists. Please help me welcome Jonmar van Vlijmen and Rosanne van Wijk. Yay. Please join me in silent applause. Yeah, so I would like to welcome you to put on your camera if I can't see you yet.
Hi.
Hi. Lovely. I hope you can see our lovely guest. I can see them right now. So for maybe a starting question, I would like to ask about how you position yourself in relation to the term ecocriticism as a lens, which is a term that maybe started in literary studies like 40 years ago, but has since been cross-fertilizing in cultural studies and in environmental studies and in the arts, philosophy, psychology, ethics, law, and is really known to be earth-centered, interdisciplinary, and activisty. So maybe starting with Suzanne, where does your practice fit in?
Yeah. Hi, nice to see you again. I think for me, I would sit myself in what was called the second wave, or the environmental justice impetus of eco-criticism. I actually come from a background of working with humanitarian organizations, working at the intersection of indigenous rights, extractivism, and then moving into climate justice and resource extraction. So in that space, my work has been often at the interface of those who are on the front lines of climate injustice, environmental racism, and negotiating with all of the different mediums that come in that work. So that can be within a nonprofit, trying to make a exhibition for awareness through campaigns. So you end up becoming an advocate and a curator in a multiplicity of forms. So I think that's where I kind of sit with it. And then it's become a kind of a case of survival as well. As a queer woman of color within the environmental movement in the last few years, particularly, there's been an increasing amount of white supremacy in terms of the erasure of the history of our movements, of replacing us with white figureheads. And so we've had to retell the story of environmental justice. So there's also the role of an archivist and a movement, her storyteller in that as well. And so I think there's another part of the history telling, and eco-criticism provides a safe space for me to step aside as well from the environmental movement and the nonprofit space to come up with research for strategies for how do we have conversations about power and privilege. How do we look at the environmental culture, which sometimes is just taken as a given, to even understand that there even is a culture within environmental activism, so that we can change that and come up with strategies that serve those on the front lines primarily as well.
Super. That is, I think, very clear and a lot to unpack in this hour as well. I'd like to ask Rosanne and Jonmar, would you be able to position your practice as the Onkruidenier in regards to eco-criticism?
Yes,
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And also nice to meet you, Suzanne. Great to be here, and hello to all guests. It's said always that you can't see our public in the digital space now.
Yeah, yeah.
What I think is very important for us is that, with the Onkruidenier, we really started to question, like, how can we as humans adapt more towards the landscape and adapt to, instead of changing it all the time. Maybe you can also tell something beautiful about it.
Yeah, of course, in the Netherlands especially, we are masters in changing our living environment according to what we need as humans. But
what we think we need.
We think we need. Yeah, that's a good addition to that. And I think in our work, in our practice, we are often outdoors, in the landscape. That is really our
thing.
Our thing, yes. We try to really intertwine eco-criticism in our practice by really experiencing it, by making environments in which people can experience a very different relationship towards nature. And we focus very much on potential transformations for human evolution, very much based on what we see in landscapes. What can we learn from plants, animals, microorganisms, and how can we come up with a very different relationship towards what we find in our living environment?
Yeah, as they are very adaptive and often have very interesting ways to adapt to difficult circumstances in the landscape. And yeah, we really find it important to keep on raising these kind of questions and challenge people who come along with us in our projects and in our presentations to experience that more and work more with our senses and
I'm gonna there. Because so I already hear like also difference in terms of how politicized or how environmental experience we have in this panel today, or this conversation today. One thing you both have in common is that you engage with this both as students and teachers. You also now give guest lectures in artistic academies. And I would like to ask both of you, both as in both of the Onkruidenier and Suzanne, to reflect on like what as an art student or an art teacher, what are some of the barriers you see or you felt to engage with environmental activism, or to stimulate environmental activism in your students? So maybe because you already started on activism, Suzanne, I'll give this to you first, and then Onkruidenier, you have a moment to think about it.
Yeah, I think, with the term that I just taught with the Ecology Futures, it was very unusual circumstances. Everybody was dealing with COVID, we were online. So I think that was a huge challenge to people to think, how do we continue to respond to the climate crisis with the new conditions that we have? And also, I think there was an intimidation as well. I think bringing my practice that has been quite intense to sort of think about, well, if I'm not ready to engage with the police or shut down refineries, does that mean I'm not an ecological activist? So it was really important for us to interrogate and to reopen up the sphere of ecological activism, and to make sure that people understand that that the students themselves understood that coming into relationship with nature, having that intimacy, having your own point of entry into the ecological crisis was really important. And then the other thing was to balance this concern, for instance, the corona crisis, how that has an ecological impact. One instance of that was masks. And how do you balance the needs of the pandemic and the cultural crisis, the climate crisis as well? So I think the best way to overcome that barrier was to have a real, a softness, a gentleness, and attention to people where they are, to really bring up the fact that our different ways that we can engage with the police, with those institutions, is okay. And by telling that wider narrative of movement history or environmental history, to show people that we have different agency in doing that. I think one of the ways of overcoming that barriers was people think sometimes art and activism in these different silos. So I really focused on bringing together a community of guest lecturers who walk between those spaces and really, really shared their vulnerabilities and my own vulnerabilities, my own questions and being unresolved. Exactly what you said, like showing how much of being a teacher and a student I am at that same time. So I think that's one of the best ways of overcoming that barriers, is the stereotypes of what activism looks like, where you sit on that, either from your identity or your ability or your relationship to even your residency in a country, or being an immigrant. So all of those things. And then the best, I think, teaching we had was how do we use the coronavirus to use digital technology? And I think we had some really interesting ways of coming up with intersectional, intergenerational strategies using digital technology. So it was a possibility as well.
Yeah, if I can follow up on that, because I see that you're already answering like ways you've overcome the barriers. I'm wondering if we can zoom back a little bit and kind of name the barriers. What are why, like, being totally blank on this, like, why aren't we all practicing through an environmental integrity protector engagement lens? Like, kind of getting at why are we why are we still doing this?
Yeah, I think, sorry, backing up. So I think some of it actually is that often the climate movement, environmental movements themselves are not inviting, especially in Europe, especially in the UK. You know, for instance, it can often be perceived that there are certain actions that you need to take to be environmentally engaged. And that's some of the media perception. It's some of the strategies that people have hooked onto. So people don't see themselves as climate activists. So that's part of one of the big barriers. And then they don't see people like them or in the perceived environmental culture. So, you know, even myself, I'm often one of the only people of color in that space. So people have to renegotiate that they are part of the environmental movement, that they're not separated, and that their entry points into it are valid as well. Or people can feel like they're not doing enough. Like, what are my plant pictures got to do with the environmental movement? So we also have to bring people into understanding that coming into right relationship, negotiating that relationship, understanding like, you know, the Dutch imagination around the landscape and is part of ecological activism. So I think it's about broadening out what that work looks like and how you can be involved in it. And I think that is one of the beginning points to enter into that, beyond the fact that the privileges that it takes to be an art academic institute. Within environmentalism itself, there are those barriers as well for artists to feel that they can be part of that.
That's great. I hear you say also reimagining the Dutch landscape. Maybe a good segue into the Onkruidenier. How do you see, what called you to action to develop this environmental practice?
Yeah, well, I remember very well that the moment that I graduated from Art Academy, being trained as a graphic designer, also working in that field, I experienced that I was constantly being inside behind my screen. I woke up in the morning after breakfast. I went to work behind my screen, and my work day would last until very late in the evening, trying to catch up with the deadlines. Yeah, it made me wonder, like, is this really the future I chose for? Is it also possible to have a practice that is more outdoor oriented, more in sync with my environment? I myself grew up on a tropical island, St. Martin, the Dutch Antilles. And I was always outdoor, always playing with the animals in the garden. I was always always outdoors. So I really missed that. And so that gave me a very, huge drive to see how I could work as an artist, including an outdoor perspective. Yeah.
And do you think that can also be a barrier for students to feel the call to action if they haven't had an upbringing in more environmentally vast situations, like really being surrounded by the concrete of the cityscape? Like, what are the barriers that students may find to even engage with this eco-activism?
Yeah, good what you mentioned. And I also, I think Suzanne also showed very beautifully how multi-layered this topic is and how entangled many things are entangled. And I think that also makes it sometimes hard to define what immediately is something that you can take on, because I also personally have to think a lot also about care and support, openness, time. There are so many things you can think of to indeed go outside and have that space and time for that. And I think also with art academies, we are very focused on the building itself. As you mentioned, the concrete or glass, if we also talk about the Arnhem Rietveld building and the workspaces there. So I think we are still, of course, there are exceptions, and I think it's more and more expanding. I see many also bachelor's and master programs going outside. I think, for example, Practice Held in Common, the master also of ArtEZ fashion is a very good example. They have the linen project in which they grow flax and from seed to plant to material and take care of the whole process. I think those examples are already there, but I think we're still very, or if I also look at myself and how I grew up, how I followed my education, I think, it was just not so much in me to just go out all the time and I don't know. It was just that I started talking with Ronald and Jomar at the Jan van Eyck and expanding ideas, as I was very much involved in systems and also the fashion system and the complexities in that. And I saw similarities with the food system, but it was a time and space we had to exchange and to then collaborate. So I think it's maybe sometimes difficult to bring that in, but we're so deadline focused, we're so short term or getting grades. I think that's still there, even though we try to overcome, it's still very much there.
I can imagine you are also your collaborative bunch as the Onkruidenier. Maybe the art world also really rewards the individual or the author to shine in that kind of box. So like kind of questioning onwards towards the next theme of like now also being in a position of a teacher, going into the art academy in different spaces. I believe you've also taught at the KBK. Like, how do you prepare a lesson plan for students to also engage in a different way?
Yeah, well, when we get an invitation to become a guest teacher or lecturer, then the first thing we propose is to bring the students outdoor, get them out of the studio spaces they get, out of the white walls. Let's get dirty. That's the first thing we would say. Let's experience and get inspiration in a very different way. How can you, we ask students often, how can you talk about your art practice when you don't bring anything from your studio? Like what happens if you leave everything behind and you find something in the landscape that we are positioning ourselves to at that moment? And how can you find something locally that you can see as an example or trigger to talk about what is important to you? So
And what has come up? Like, what has surprised you most going into teaching?
Yeah, I remember a very nice example in the Maastricht Art Academy. We were teaching for a week. It was a project week. students from the fine arts department. And we started with studio visits, like very short, 20 minutes, introductions. So I visited, Roland and I at that time visited the students, around 20 of them, and they gave little presentations in their studio. And there was one guy, Noah, his name was, and he said, please sit down, and I will not tell about my work. I will I will make music with the music instruments I produce. And that was really beautiful already. So when we went with the group of 20 fine arts students to the local Entail in Maastricht, a former cement factory, with the question, how can you talk about or create an experience for people to understand your practice based on what you find in the Entail? And he found a kind of electricity transformator, this little building, you know, and this little building made a constant sound, like, I cannot reproduce that, of course, but there was a sound constantly very monotone, and he decided to improvise with his body and produce sound according to the sound of this little electricity building. And he asked people to join in, and we produced a kind of music soundscape together, like an improvised orchestra. And it was such a beautiful...
Something you never expected.
Exactly. And we felt a very kind of connectedness with all the people in the group listening and taking part in this improvised art piece. It was really a surprise. Yeah.
Thanks for painting a picture. That was very nice. So shifting gear from being surprised to being prepared, Suzanne, I want to ask like a little bit more about how do you prepare for a lesson plan?
Yeah, I think with guest lecturing, which I've done, you know, at different spaces like Goldsmiths and in London, that focus was really for me on telling the movement history and rewriting this erasure of us from the climate movement. So I think a lot of the time I work as an archivist, I try and find images, and sometimes they're images of myself where I've been, you know, written out of the Art Not Oil Coalition or different spaces. I'm writing myself back in and telling this story about how the environmental movement has been working to produce these images that we see now co-opted by movements, but the legacy of where they came from, the principles of collaboration. And the reason why I do that is to activate within the audience or within the students is their own capacity for eco-criticism, to shake up and question what they're seeing in The Guardian, who is making the pictures, and also to understand the non-profit industrial complex and how who gets the funding determines what campaigns we see, what strategies we see, and why we're not seeing people. And so a lot of it is, you know, telling that story, activating eco-criticism, and sharing a lot of the strategies that I've used to talk about power and privilege within the movement, and then also playing with that stereotype and showing some of the works that I've made. Then what shifted with the term and having a longer term, that was a really amazing transition, because now it was more about developing journaling strategies, ways for people to connect to place, to go through their own biographies, to revisit that relationship with nature. And so a lot of it was personal journaling work, reflection work, coming to understand their space. And a lot of people, I realize, are really scared to talk about ecological activism because they're worried they'll get it wrong. So having safe spaces to think through, and a big part of that was case studies. So taking an ecological situation and mapping all of the viewpoints and all of the ways of approaching that, And I think that's a really important thing to counter ecofascism, because when we have these binaries or, you know, kind of intense veganism or this kind of zealousness around these issues, that's when we can get binaries. So also understanding how to map out a situation before you engage in it.
And maybe you can take us through that process, because you have been in this space for so long. So certain things may become natural to you, but I can imagine there are people listening who are either student or teacher, and they're like, where do I start? Like, how, if you do a mapping in terms of a project that you've led, or maybe recently you've been teaching at Ecology Futures, maybe you can give an example of like how does that work?
Yeah, even mapping your day, mapping the ecosystems that you come into contact with, the spaces of change that you interact with. Is it your bank? Is it your post office? Is it your teacher? So understanding that within your own life, where are all these possibilities of engagement, of change, and then it takes it away from being this big capitalism, which is totally abstract, or nature, which is the earth in 2050, to it being your neighborhood, your community, your local garden. And I think that's part of decolonizing, as well as coming into place, coming into center, and also coming into your identity. So, you know, we're teaching in the Netherlands, so understanding the colonial legacy of being in Amsterdam, of being next to Shell. So I think that was the first part, was to really gently start mapping out your day, mapping out your territory, mapping out where you are, how you engage with power, before we even come up with any forms. And then I think that can inform the rest of your practice, and having a safe space to do that without feeling like you're going to be attacked for your identity, because it's a really vulnerable process to go through. So, and then continuing that with journaling, so that there's a place to, because it can bring up a lot of difficulty or questions. So keep journaling and staying in conversation with that. So those were two of the core practices that underlay the other sort of more traditional case study or making practices as well. And then the last thing I would say would be really centering the guest lectures, as I mentioned before. And that was a way to, you know, have an honest conversation about with someone who you consider is this pillar of the environmental movement, and to hear their concerns and what they need. I think that's such a big part. What is needed in the environmental movement from these relationships? You know, sometimes it's just graphics to bring attention to a humanitarian crisis. So I think that helped as well for people to think, okay, how can I build relationships to actually understand what is needed as well?
I recognize that we always need designers for actions, and people have this idea in their head of environmentalism as just the demonstration, and there's so much behind the scene, which is about weaving the narrative, weaving different relations, weaving. So I have a ton of more questions, but I think it's time to check in with what's happening in the chat, and I see there's already been some questions. So let me read the first question by Joke. Suzanne, could you please give an example of a concrete art project you worked on with your students? How is this project an example of eco-criticism in art education? And does it have any influence on the way Art Institute is organized? So that's, you could probably talk an hour about this already. So I'm going to ask you to maybe pick one of those questions to give a taster of the concrete project.
Yeah, and so the case studies were a very concrete project. So they were a presentation, and it was people choosing a ecological situation. So one example was someone looked at population control and how that factors into the climate crisis. So the task was to develop a map, either visually, and that was open, to try and represent all of the perspectives, as I mentioned, within that conversation, within that, and the implications of it. So we explore different ways of how you can even map that conversation. What are the sources? And that was really interesting, to map out Twitter content or social media content. So that was one way in which we were bringing art criticism, eco-criticism into the art academy, strategies of mapping, ways of presentation, ways of holding multiplicity of beliefs. And I think that had an influence on also questioning other projects in other modules, to question, like, why I'm working with kombucha and I'm making these molds. Why am I making it? What is the context? How does my framing sit? And also, have I checked in with the ecological world to see what's going on versus in just what's immediately alive in me? So I think case studies as a form are really interesting, and they're really valuable for the climate movement, because we don't often even do that within the climate movement, to like hold all those opinions and feel them. So that would be my example.
Thank you. I see we have another question. This one is directed to everyone, and I will start by asking it to the Onkruidenier. Are there ways to conciliate eco-criticism and technology with an eye on the increasing presence of AI and bioengineering? Do you reflect on this in your practice?
Yeah.
Let that land.
Well, I think that for us, it's also very important to acknowledge and work with the different systems that are entangled. So for example, that we work a lot outside, and indeed all the different stories that you can find there when you look into the history of the place, when you talk to people there. I think that's also very important to mention, not only for us in our workspace, but maybe also for institutions and art practices, that we see everyone as an expert. People who live here or walk here every day, people who walk their dog, or a farmer, everyone is an expert and knows so many things about that specific place. So I think we also have to make more space to bring in people with this kind of embodied experiences, real embodied experience. I think that's also very important, but that's also a side note where I wanted to go to. But you always come across different types of systems, and indeed the industry or the supermarket or technology. And I think these bring up different and hard questions, but I personally don't believe in that we only have to go a certain way or only go fully eco. I mean, we are in the position where we are now, and all these different systems are entangled, and we have to keep an eye on it. And yeah, if I read the question of Sander, I would say that we as artists bring up these different type of systems via bringing in objects that we find or make, or stories.
Yeah, and I think it's also topics that come into our practice when we work in the landscape together with local experts like scientists or farmers. Like when for a whole growing season, we worked together with farmer Martin in Zeeland, who showed us in April, at the beginning of the growing season, what he would put in the soil. And those were blue pills. And the blue pills were seeds. They were entirely adjusted according to EU laws, saying that there should be a certain amount of pesticides or other things to support or protect the plant in the first 6 weeks of the cycle of the plant. Yeah, and then suddenly you are talking to a local farmer about these kind of topics and how it works in their practice. So yeah, it is something that's that comes up often. Yeah,
I like what I hear. I mean, there's a tendency to take the technology very in a either fetish way, like especially in art, technology or AI can be a little bit of a fetish. And on the other side, there can be a purity, like nature as a pure thing that cannot be spoiled by anything. And I like how you take it to a very practical level of like, well, when we talk to the farmer, this is what we come against, and this is where the dilemmas arise. I want to ask Suzanne, because it was asked to everyone, how you reflect on this. Are there ways to conciliate eco-criticism and technology? How do you come across this in your work?
Yeah, I think personally in my own practice, the coronavirus has meant that we've had to increase the creative ways that we do action, to do research around that, to research around how we care for each other on online spaces as well. So that's been out of necessity. We can't stop the climate work. So how do we continue to, connect with folks in the Amazon, to do the webinars, which, are such a core part of learning in that. So I think that's been like scaling up and being mindful of access. And then the other way, which came up really interesting with the students with this term, was about finding forms that do exactly what you said, don't fetishize, but bring into question this relationship. So one project looked at fake news and the coronavirus, and this story about how the dolphins were returning to the Venice canals. And they made a radio play generated with AI from all of the fake news. And it was incredible because the experience of the radio play was kind of bringing into question how we're receiving news right now, how coronavirus has changed our relationship to science. So I think that's when it does it beautifully, that there are forms that allow us to have an experience, that bring us into question. And also one of my students explored cryptocurrencies. And the possibilities of cryptocurrencies that could support organizations right now. And I think that's a really interesting space where I see a lot of resistance from climate activists in the ecological world because of the footprint, yet at the same time, this is the economy that we're going into. And if we're thinking about changing economies, if we need to get resources to spaces, then cryptocurrency becomes a really interesting space. So I think when art can create forms that brings us to reflect and to challenge and bring those different interdisciplinaries together, I think that's the sweet spot.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, like rethinking that currency and economy is already rethinking that in a narrative where economy is a part of world ecology and not the other way around. Yeah. I see more questions popping up in the chat. And so here we have one. What does eco-criticism entail for material practices within the art school? Who would like to pick this one up?
Yeah.
Well, we also learned from the Jan van Eyck Academy. They now started also, or when we were there doing the residency, there was the Nature Lab started with Jasmine Ossendorf as a head. And yeah, they also started Future Materials Bank, which can also be found on their Instagram. And I think that's also very inspiring to learn what alternatives there are, and also that they provide that for the artists who are working there as a reflection. So yeah, I think that we can definitely think about the materials we used. But I personally also would love to add that I also think that it's not only in finding solutions for materials, or I think we really have to stay critical about the whole working, living environment we situate ourselves in, and that it also really is a lot about, well, the systems we inhabit is how we have to also, or we have to practice the systems we inhabit. So, and I think only using better materials is not
gonna cut it. Yeah, there's a tendency as a safe space. Like if we look at this material thing, then we can check the green box and we've done it. Yeah. I do have to think, last week I was on a panel around the work of Claudie Jongstra. Mm-hmm. And she works with, really the material of making the fabric, a lot of textile work herself, and also the coloring with natural dye of plants. And she told somewhere that the sheep, the wool, what used to be like a whole, like industry, today's farmers, they are often burning the wool because the market is so distorted that they can't get the wool anywhere. And they're super happy when she, asked to buy the wool, because the prices are so low that just, it's not even workable. So often a material can also already unleash the bigger questioning of like how to rethink the entire economy.
And also that says something about time and the time pressure that's there. So if we also raise or educate students in academies also at time pressure, I mean, we continue this sort of goal and oriented and efficiency. So I think, of course, that's super hard to change on the short term, but I think we really should also keep on thinking about that and how we also can help each other there. Maybe even how art academies can help each other with that. I mean, we're in such a difficult bureaucratic system often that I think everyone is doing their best, but it's not always
it's not good enough. So this is the part where I like to shift gear and to radically invite you to reimagine the Art Institute, to just put it out there, like in what ways could we do it differently that would serve the landscape, the places, the people, our communities, our societies in so many ways. So kind of thinking already in the chat, there's a question of like, should we have different language that we need to situate, different policies, different architecture? I like to ask both of you to reflect on that and like rethinking the institution. Can we name some imaginaries and calls to actions? I would like to start with Suzanne.
Yeah, I think for me, actually, I already find working within the Art Academy strangely more liberating than what I was going through in the climate movement and the environmental sector. I think it's important to note the environmental sector is the second least diverse industry. So you're coming from a space where you're not even recognized as a thinker, the longevity of your career, most people are done by their 30s. So for me to imagine how the Art Academy could be in service of the environmental movement, I think that we need more training. So those of us who move between art and activism might not even consider what we do art, need space to be held to articulate our practice. So residencies, retreats, healing, often from PTSD and burnout. So there are so many people within the movement who have this pedagogical knowledge, this cultural knowledge that need time to transition. So that would be beautiful to take care of those individuals to scale up. The other thing would be to have deeper relationships with the art institutions. I'm often brought on as a panel to add diversity and stir and bring the brown perspective. And I'm like, okay, also ask me to curate something, ask me to produce new works. So we need a shift right now where we're not just speaking on ecological justice as a side panel or at the talks of the event that we're brought in to curate. And so what is the relationship between the academy and the galleries that could foster that? The other thing would be increasing scholarships so that we can address the basic lack of diversity within the Art Academy as well, and to prioritize, again, those folks who are doing that work and need that support. Also, I think to continue to build the relationships. I work sometimes with scriptwriters and folks in Hollywood who are trying to understand how to represent these narratives within that medium. So could we have more think labs as well, where we come together to question the forms, to develop this eco-criticism within mainstream media, within those production, so that we can be having these conversations. And then the last thing I think would be spaces for innovation that are interdisciplinary and really rethinking art. And I was on a panel with the Tate the other day, and this was exactly what we were saying, that it's not just about reducing the footprint, it's about a renaissance. So for a renaissance, we need to become artists, scientists, crypto developers, thinking alongside farmers. So could the art academy itself really rethink and become ambitious about what is being asked of art at this time? Yeah, and take some risks. Like, don't be so, as an individual, don't be so concerned with your career, or that, really be in that risk-taking moment of what's being asked of us. So that would be my art school.
Yeah, I love to go there. Can I go there? I hope everybody's taking notes. I'm so excited about what's bubbling up. Can I ask Yunmar and Rosanna to sketch the outlines of rethinking the institution you wish for every art student to be able to go to?
Yeah. Well, yeah. If you ask me, I would start the first open air art academy, and also change the whole curriculum to see if you can include different kinds of disciplines, teachers from different kind of backgrounds. Why can a farmer not be a teacher in an art academy, for example? Or a geologist, or there are so many different kinds of disciplines that I believe students have a hunger for different kinds of knowledge. Also, this very interdisciplinary approach that Suzanne also mentioned already.
I think seeing the art academy as an ecosystem and what is necessary for that. I mean, and also how can we all take care, and also the people who participate in that, how can they take care of that? I think also very the everyday life is a super big part of that, and that's also where I think what Suzanne said beautifully, also with people don't refer often to as activism, but I think we are also having more of these kind of things in our daily life already, or thoughts, or how can we take care of that in how we live? Maybe is the living environment of students is also connected to an art academy, and can we take care of each other there? How do we can take care of the waste, for example? I mean, these are all these kind of tasks that we have separated, but what if we see the institution as a whole ecosystem that everyone together has to take care of? That's something I can imagine as well, and to root really in the space where you are, and the land and the environment there.
I can imagine that also really with this reimagining and taking responsibility for waste, not just for what comes in and what we consume, but what goes out, comes other values. Like, would you be able to also reflect a little bit on like what value shift would happen in such an art academy?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I personally always start then with also asking myself, then what do I need? And then you already start to feel like, oh yeah, you don't want waste. I think nobody wants that, but we're just so
used to it.
Yeah, exactly. And what makes me happy, and that's often connection and togetherness. And I mentioned before already in this meeting the practice held in Common Master, but I think they also raise those questions that are super elementary and important.
And maybe it's nice for the people that are attending the building that we are currently in, and our background. This building is the Buitenplaats Brienenoord in Rotterdam. And this building is entirely built with waste material. I think it's a very beautiful example of how you can create new structures and cultural places with a lot of respect to the environment it is positioned.
Okay, so I wish I could ask you 1,000 other questions, but I see the clock ticking. This is another thing, this colonial concept of this 60 seconds, minute, squeeze it and get as much out of it as we can. So I'm gonna start going into our shout out ending, because I hope that everybody attending today has gotten some inspiration to take a next step in their practice, either as a teacher or student or activist or otherwise. But I'm sure there's so many other works and people that inspire us, or things that we have made that we might be able to give a shout out to, so people have some materials to engage with onwards and forwards. So yeah, Rosanna, would you like to start?
Sure. Well, maybe one note according also, or relating to what you said with the economical clock, I would also invite everyone to adapt a bit more to the biological clock and nature's rhythm, circadian time, as they also call it, as we try in our project Sweet Sweat to adapt also to the tides and see what that does to us. So we're, as Jomar now said, at Brinoord Island, and we'll also do a performative presentation here this weekend on Saturday evening when it's high tide. So if anyone is near here, we're doing a very small group, 7 per session. So if anyone is feeling like, okay, I can also, or I'm in for adapting to the circadian rhythm, be also welcome here. But I think it's also something we can all try in our own living environment. So yeah.
And if they want to join, they would need to sign up where? Can you name the website or the platform where people need to go then?
Yeah, great. I saw that Jana greatly added the link from Buitenplaats Brinoord from the website in the chat, so you can check it out there. And they also made a post on their Facebook. You have to send an email to Sander, but that's all very practical. So it will, you will find it out, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Awesome. So switching to Suzanne. We are running out of time, so I'm going to switch to Suzanne. That's okay. What would be your shout out? Like, what work, artists, collectives, something you're working on, do people need to know to?
Yeah, I think it's one thing I'd leave in. One work that I made was that I switched a megaphone to a listening device. And it was really about that. It was about, before you speak, before you start working on anything, put your ear to the ground. And you know, this paradox of actually technology at the moment bringing us closer. So understanding how what is happening in Gaza right now is connected to the settler colonialism, which is connected to the environmental crisis. So really opening ourselves up to understand what is happening, to take in those struggles, to understand how we can amplify them, and that humility to situate ourselves in them. So I think that would be the big thing, is to spend that time reflecting and to understand how to be in service. So wherever you can connect to the earth, to the land, to the water, to ask for your place and for your role in this, and to empty yourself out, to be ready to receive that. It might come in a dream, it might come in an inspiration. So really activating yourself in that, to be receptive to that as well. So that would be my work to inspire people to.
Yeah, excellent. And I see also in the chat people are sharing. I see that there's been a link to Blue City on an agenda on a hackathon, biobase, on Dutch wool. I see that people are sharing thanks, and that is very insightful. So I'd like to thank all of the guests for inspiring everyone. And a final comment that in New Zealand, there is a primary school system called Environment School. As a school, you can go through stages of implementing new strategies toward starting at bronze and going to gold. So with the last step, connecting the outer environment into the school. So that might be something of a practical thing to look into. Yeah, and thank you for all the speakers for connecting the dots. I think environmental work always calls us to connect ever more dots and find that they are breathing and have beating hearts and that we are connected to it and not dots at all. So yeah, I want to thank everybody for joining today, and do keep looking out for how we meet again on the next online lunch event. It's been a pleasure to be your host, and I wish you a lovely day and creative practice.
Thanks.
Thank you
so much.
It was a real pleasure.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. Enjoy the sun.